سلام، نهمین شماره از مجموعه گفتگوهای دورنما رو میبینید. در این شماره با دیوید تورفیل، استاد مطالعات اسلام در دانشگاه سودرتورن سوئد و نویسنده کتاب زیست شیعی گفتگو خواهیم کرد. با او درباره تجربه کار میدانیش در ایران به عنوان پژوهشگر غیر بومی و همینطور وضعیت عمومی مطالعات اسلام و مطالعات شیعه در کشور سوئد صحبت خواهیم کرد. با عذرخواهی از شنوندگان فارسی زبان این گفتگو به انگلیسی انجام خواهد شد و ما بعدتر زیرنویس فارسی رو بهش اضافه خواهیم کرد. Hey David, welcome to this episode of Dورنما.
Thank you.
Thank you. To start off, please introduce yourself for our audiences in more detail and tell us a bit about your background and studies, and we will go further later in your work on Iran and living Shiism.
Yes. Okay, so I'm a professor in the study of religions, and my sort of specific field is history of religions, and kind of discipline that we sometimes refer to as comparative religion. So it's the academic study of religion from a historical and sociological and psychological perspective, you can say. And in my discipline, it is a tradition that you specialize in at least two different religious traditions. Because the idea is just like if you study language, I mean, you can know one language really well, but if you want to understand language as a human phenomenon, you need to know, I mean, a couple of languages to understand what language is. And the same thing with the study of religions. I mean, you can know one tradition really well, but if you want to understand religion as a cultural phenomenon, you need to zoom out and study different religions and compare them. So my first sort of chosen religion was Shiite Islam. And in particular, it's obviously a vast field. So my special focus was sort of Shiism as a living practice in contemporary Iran. So my method in my research has always been primarily ethnographic and interview-based. So I am very fond, I suppose, of visiting and getting to know environments, religious environments that I don't know from beforehand, and to sort of let myself be submerged into the different life worlds that religion offers. And I've had the privilege of doing this in various Iranian Shiite settings. So I studied at the University of Isfahan 30 years ago, or almost 30 years ago, and I wrote my PhD on Iranian Shiism, and I have since then also written on different aspects of Shiism.
Great, thank you. Let's just specifically ask you about the practical details of writing the book Living Shiism, which was your doctoral thesis, in fact. You said about choosing Shiism as the kind of different culture and religion to know more about. What made you decide to work on Iran and study Shiism in Shiite context, actually? And how did you get to the final topic? For example, you decided to work with grassroots religious people and study in Isfahan. About these details,
yes,
tell us about.
Yes, it was. I mean, there are different answers to this question. I mean, why did I make the choice? And I think the most honest answer is, or the truest answer. I mean, you can always find different narratives and what made me choose this. And my initial interest in the history of religion was Indian religions. I studied in India in high school. I lived there in Tamil Nadu in South India. And actually my first encounter with Shiism as a tradition, which I knew nothing about at that time, was that I witnessed this Ashura procession in Chennai in South India. And it was very dramatic. I didn't really understand what's going on here. It was very dramatic and a bit frightening, I have to say, because they were bleeding and
I can imagine.
far out versions of this tradition, and I was very intrigued by that, and I couldn't really understand what it was. I saw it in the sort of context of South Indian ritual traditions, where there are often also in a Hindu context, there would be quite extreme festivals where people would, for instance, put what you call them, sort of suspend themselves with these kind of metal hooks that they would put through their flesh, and they would hang flying around like this. And it's very crazy stuff going on in a Hindu context. So I saw this as a part of that sort of quite extreme ritual festival type of tradition in South India. But I was intrigued by also this Islamic tradition, and then eventually I moved away. My interest moved from the South Asian Indian context towards the Persian region, and I was fascinated by this whole sort of cultural area that was dominated by Persian Empire culture. So not only Iran, but also Afghanistan, parts of Central Asia, and also India, specifically northern India, where the Mughal dynasty there had Persian as its sort of court language, and there was massive Persian influence also on Indian culture, of course. And this sort of, and also stretching westwards into contemporary Iraq and the Kurdish regions and so on. So this region sort of became my area of interest. I started to define this region as my area of interest, and I studied the languages there. I studied some Arabic, of course, and also Hindi and Urdu, and then Persian. So I was fascinated by this region. And then there was also an element of exotism for me in this. I grew up in the 70s and 80s. And during the 80s, I was sort of 7 to 17 years old, which was a very formative period. And this was during the Iran-Iraqi war, and Iran and Khomeini and it sort of Islamist regime in Iran, and the Islamic Revolution was very present in media because of the war. And there were many Iranians also who came to Sweden. So this was sort of a field that became very exposed also in this part of the world. And it was seen as a dangerous place. This is a dangerous place. It's understandable and dangerous. And I'm a bit adventurous in my personality. So if someone says that this is a dangerous place, you probably shouldn't go there, I pack my bag. so this was one of the reasons. It's exotism and sort of adventure spirit. But then I started studying Persian at Uppsala University, and then I moved to Iran and studied one semester at Södertörn University. And then, of course, I got to know this country, and in many ways, it was a difficult time for me. I was a bit isolated from other students there in the university, and I didn't meet anyone who was non-Iranian, and I couldn't really pick my Iranian friends freely either, because I was sort of directed to this sort of specific part of the university life there. But there was one instance then at this. I had one friend. They were all Basij people. I mean, the people I was sort of introduced for by the university. They were sort of safe friends for me by their reckoning. And one of them was a really, really nice man. And I asked, could I come to some gatherings or something? I was interested in religion, obviously. And he brought me to this Duai Kumail meeting in one of the mosques there. And he drove me on his motorbike through the streets, and we came to this meeting. It was night. It was after the evening prayer, and some people lingered in the mosque. And it was a Thursday night then, obviously, and this recitation of Dua Kumail began. And as you know, they intertwine the Arabic supplication with sort of segments of retelling these stories about it's mostly about stories of Hussein and so on. Sorry, I'll just if there's some kind of sound there, I would try to close it. Yeah, and this Dua Kumail meeting then was really a powerful event for me. It really struck me as something profoundly interesting and almost sublime. And it also reminded me of something in my own tradition. And this is sort of deeper psychological explanation for my interest in this particular tradition. Because I come from a family, it's a Christian family, and my parents, and actually in particular my grandparents and the tradition that they come from a pietistic Lutheran heritage. So they are Christian Protestant Lutherans, and of the specific version that is what we call pietism. So it's a very sort of emotional type of religious tradition where sort of the experience of grace is very important. So the sort of the main ritual feeling, it's not overly ritualistic, it's not charismatic, it's kind of calm in a way, but there's this feeling that the grace of God, although we are fallen humans, we are sinful, and we have broken the rules of God, and we deserve punishment. But despite our fallenness, this is like the theme in this pietistic Lutheran tradition, despite our fallenness, God has shown us grace. God loves us despite of this. He forgives us despite of this. Despite our fallenness, we can still be loved by this benevolent God. And the whole idea is that when you realize that there's this love despite our fallenness, this becomes very sort of emotional and moving. So it's like, oh no, I don't deserve this, but still I get it. Oh, this is the kind of religious feeling that has been cultivated in that type of tradition, and that I've been exposed to in my childhood and further back. And I met something in this Shiite Dua Kumail kind of setting that is quite similar in terms of sentiments. And I even actually translated some of the prayer meetings that I later recorded and visited, translated and showed my father, who is even more trained or sort of grown up in that Lutheran tradition. And yeah, he was very moved by it, because it was the same. The feeling is almost, this is the same tradition. Have you heard the story of Rasul Tork? Rasul Tork is sort of a story. So he's this bad man. He's a drunkard and a sinner, and is a lot, one of these bazaar hooligans or whatever. He's a hooligan. He's a criminal and a hooligan. He's a bad Muslim. I mean, by all standards, he drinks and fights and all the things. And then the story that I heard in one of these settings that I visited, in one of these hayats, the Rasul Tork comes to this mosque, or maybe it's a Husseini, and he says, can I come in and pray? And the chief of the boss in the place says no. The manager says no, you're drunk. I mean, you can't come in here. This is a religious place.
You're not qualified.
You're not qualified. And then the manager of the mosque sends Rasul Tork away. But then in the night, he dreams this dream. And he dreams of a desert. And in the desert, he sees this tent. And there's a green light emanating from the tent. And obviously, this is the tent of Imam Hussein. And then there's a dog. And I mean, in this country, we love the dogs,
Yes.
But in an Iranian context, they're kind of, a very filthy, it could be a snake or a rat or something. So this dog comes and wants to come into the tent. And then he just, in this dream, he sees this arm, sort of shining arm, which is the arm then of Imam Hussein, opening the tent and letting the dog in. So this grace of this Imam, despite the fallenness of the dog. And the manager of the mosque realizes that this is obviously about this Rasul Turk guy who came, he wanted to pray, he wanted to turn around his life, and I turned him away. And then I think the end of the story is that he goes and he invites him to the mosque. And in some of these, because I've written about this, what I call the Hayati movement, you know, this sort of contemporary Hayats where they have a very passionate, almost, you know, these maddas who would be like pop stars, even traveling around the country, and this very sort of rhythmic and modern and innovative ways of the chest beating that you can find in these environments. And some of the people in some of these hayats, they would refer to themselves as Kalbe Hussein or something like the dog. I'm the dog of Hussein. I'm nothing. I'm just so fallen. And then there's a combination of being a dog, a worthless, fallen person, which makes the sense of grace coming from God even greater, because you know how fallen you are. So then this grace, wow, and this you can get very emotional about that. And that combination of fallenness and accepting grace, which I find in some Shiite traditions is very similar in terms of sentiments and emotional feeling as the tradition that I come from. So I think perhaps by studying that type of religion in Iran, that type of religious sentiments, I have also been able to understand something about my own tradition. So maybe there's some kind of deeper psychological interest for me in understanding myself that's behind this. And then I will tell you that when the very first day when I started studying history of religions at Uppsala University, and this was a defining sort of moment for me, the professor at the university there, he began the whole course, I mean, the whole program in the history of religions by saying this, and said like this. This is what he said, the first sentence, as I remember it. He said, the history of religions departs from this understanding that we are one humanity. There's one humanity. You know, there are different languages and cultures and religions, but we are one humanity. And the fact that we are one humanity means that we can understand others by understanding ourselves, and we can understand ourselves by understanding others. So if I study, you know, religious life in Papua New Guinea among some tribal group in the middle of the jungle there, and I understand some of their worldview and how they relate to their loved ones and to their gods and to nature, there's something in that makes me also understand something in myself. I mean, I can understand myself, and I can study ancient Egyptian traditions, and this will also teach me something about myself. And also in the other way around, if I understand myself, if I understand my own sentiments and why I get angry or sad or moved or loving or hateful or whatever it is, then maybe I can understand why other people get into those states of mind, even if those other people lived in, you know, Iraq 3,000 years ago. So there's this humanistic understanding of humanity as one. And I like that. This is sort of the starting point for comparative study of religion.
Thanks. It was interesting. And given these facts, I can ask about your book and its Persian translation, actually. Who do you think the audience of the text could be? I mean, is this text suitable for Iranian and Shiite audience, or you write it just for people outside this context, as you talked about the similarities of your culture and your background to some of those feelings? Is it something that you write for them, or it's also for Iranian audiences?
Well, I mean, it's written for sort of the audience I had in mind were people who were not actually in this community that I'm writing about, because I think it is actually it's not that many studies that portray grassroots, sort of conservative grassroots Iranian religiosity among men. There are many studies about the ideology of sort of Iranian Islamic tradition of Khomeini and the Islamic Republic. There are many studies about political implications and all kinds of stuff. There are quite a few ethnographic, anthropological studies of sort of secular Iranians and their life. And there are some studies, quite few, about women sort of pious life. Mm-hmm. But this may, because my book is about men.
Yeah.
And, it's about pious Iranian men, and on a grassroots level. And I think it's not so many books about them. And still, these are the men that many people talk about. People are very engaged in what they do and what they believe and so on. So my contribution, my humble contribution then is to show, my attempt has been to show some of what this movement means for them on a personal, near life kind of level. So it's not so much about the ideology or their social movement, but more about the personal meanings that their religious engagement has for them. And obviously, I write for those who don't know these men, but there are many people who don't know these men also in Iran, also among Iranians, also among Shiites, because my impression, I don't know if you share this impression as an Iranian, but my impression as an outsider of Iran and Iranian society is that there are very clear sort of divisions between different layers of the populations, especially in terms of ideology and sort of view of what the Iranians are like. I mean, this might a bit, if I stretch it a little bit, it is almost as if every Iranian I talk to tells me with great confidence what the Iranians are like. And they would always...
The Iranian are.
Yeah, the Iranians are like this. And if I speak to these conservative sort of pro-regime men that I wrote about in the thesis, they will say, like, almost all Iranians, the Iranian people, they share our values and our understanding and the way we view the world. But then there are some sort of youngsters in Tehran who've been fooled by American sort of propaganda. There are very few, but there are some, there. But that's a problem. But a vast majority are like us. And then I go to my friends in Tehran, sort of secular friends in Tehran, and they will say, well, Iranian, we are like this. It's a massive consensus about our position. And then there are some Quran readers in the villages, and they're a problem, but most are like us. And the people sort of support on the leftist side or on the royalist side, or they all share this self-confidence in telling me what the Iranians are like. And I don't know, but actually there are quite good survey studies about Iranian values, which is quite interesting, quite good sort of data, quantitative sociological data about the values from World Value Survey, for instance, about which are statistically sound studies about values and also political and ethical and religious values among Iranian people. And it shows that, of course, it's much more, it's kind of balanced. I did some interviews with people who were involved in this sort of Hayati revival that preceded the Ahmadinejad's selection when he became president. And in that movement, there was a strong sense of being just riding the wave of a complete religious revival of Iranian society in that sort of charismatic Shiite direction. This is how religion works. I mean, in Sweden, we have I've written about Pentecostal Christianity, which is a charismatic form of Christianity. And if you go to charismatic Christian meetings in Stockholm, for instance, where I am now, the feeling of the people there and the preachers there and the people involved in that movement will be like, now we are at the brink of a revolution. Now everyone is going to become a Pentecostal Christian, because this is now it's happening. We have this feeling of social movement, a wave of revivalism, Christian revivalism. And if you go to the meetings, you get that feeling. This is how they talk about everything. This is the stories they tell. This is how it seems to be in their part of the world. But then if you zoom out a little bit, if you just go to the people on the street outside of the church, they won't even know what Pentecostalism is. I mean, we live in bubbles like this. And I think that is also very true of the Iranian situation.
Yeah. I have two questions related to what you said. One is about your difficulties and limitations. One of them you mentioned about this kind of perspective of Iranians about themselves. But the other is about the lived religion. But let's just focus on the first question about your limitations as a non-Iranian, actually, researcher in Iran.
Yes, that's an interesting sort of methodological question. And I have really done both things. I have written on this book that we're talking about now on Iranian religion, and I'm not Iranian, I'm not Muslim. I speak some Farsi, but it's not perfect, and I'm a complete outsider. And then I've also written about my own tradition, sort of Lutheran, secular Lutheran Swedish majority population. I've written about that group also. So I really studied my own world and the world which is initially completely different and alien to me. And there are pros and cons of both. So if I speak about the Iranian context, one sort of methodological benefit of being an outsider, and this I really think is a great benefit, is that I'm not an important person in these environments. So people can speak, I'm an outsider, which means that people, once I had gained their confidence, they could speak very openly with me. I'm not friends of their families. I don't know their mother and father or their teachers. I'm just a complete outsider. So it's almost like a psychotherapist, someone that you go to and they promise you it's completely confidential. And I also promise them confidentiality. I mean, they are anonymized. I think they're very difficult to find the people behind. They don't even know each other, the people in the group. So I'm really a sort of a safe person to talk to, which means you can open up. And the fact that I will leave the country, it's really safe. This is so they can just spill out their dreams. And they've been really personal with me. Also much more personal than comes through in the book, speaking about all kinds of stuff, like close friends or like a psychotherapist or something. And this is a good benefit. Another benefit of being the outsider is that you but obviously there are many negative things as well. I mean, the lack of understanding. I mean, I don't know all the symbols, and I cannot sort of decode the culture and what different behaviors mean. I cannot really understand. If you come as an Iranian into this place, you would immediately decode lots of things, but it takes time. I mean, what kind of signals, like for instance, you're an Iranian, now you live in Sweden, but this kind of jacket that I wear, for an Iranian, it means nothing. I mean, it's just, okay, maybe this is a Swedish jacket. I don't know, what is it? But I think for a Swedish person, in my sort of stratum of Swedish society, this will signal something. This type of jacket will signal something. And I think perhaps this will signal that I'm sort of academic, sort of in urban academic who wants to signal that he is something else than a part of the urban environment. Something. It's sort of it has certain cultural connotations. And I suppose your scarf, the everything, it has connotations.
Yes.
The fact that I have a map, it's maybe, everything has cultural meaning that an outsider won't see. And that, of course, is a very negative thing, which means that you have to stay long and you have to decipher. On the other hand, the stupidity that comes with this, the lack of knowledge, also make people explain things to you. So I would never explain to another Swede who comes from my own what this jacket signifies. But if I meet an Iranian anthropologist would come here and study Swedish academics, for instance, well, then I would articulate something like this. And this would provide a type of information that you would never give to a fellow community member. So you can actually get hold of information and ideas and levels of culture that an insider would not get access to. And I think that's a benefit. And also it's because especially when you don't speak the language that well, you will come through as kind of harmless. So now we chose to have this talk in English because I speak English better than I speak Farsi. So it means I can come through as an authority, or I can be sort of an intellectual scholar. If I were to speak Farsi now, I would be a little bit silly, I would make small language mistakes. I would be a harmless nobody. Who is this guy?
Yes.
This means that if you come into an environment and you're just this harmless, slightly silly person, people can also open up to you because you're not a threat. If you come as a fancy professor from Europe, then it can be a bit threatening, intimidating. But if you're this sort of immigrant with a bad grammar, well, people can open up. And I think,
of course, this does not mean that you pretend to be someone else.
No.
Means just that their impression.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. Because and this we can, since you mentioned that, I mean, you really, if you do ethnographic fieldwork, you really cannot pretend.
Yeah.
It's a very important rule, and also I think it's methodologically dangerous. I know journalists, maybe sometimes they can pretend and they do undercover work, but this is not how we work. I mean, it's very important when you do ethnographic field work as a researcher that you are not pretending. You have to be extremely honest. I mean, much more honest than you are in everyday life. Just telling, this is my ambition, I'm writing this book, this is what I want to do, so that you play straight and that you're honest with all the informants and people that will talk to you. But even if you do that, there's a psychology in interhuman interaction where if someone speaks a language poorly, this will sort of lower the status of that person in the social interaction. This is just how it works. Yeah. But having a low status in the group, being seen as harmless and sort of not so important a person, can also open up for people to give you talk more openly and freely and more in a more interesting way to you.
Yeah, great. It was more pros and cons, of course.
It's both. It's really both. And also, when it comes to this particular thesis that I wrote, because of the political tensions in Iranian society, I think if I had been sort of a liberal, secular Teherani researcher, I think this particular field would have been more difficult for me because they would think, well, who is this? What's this person doing? But I was a complete outsider. There was a saying in Sweden a couple of years back, maybe this has changed, that Iranians who sit in a bus in Sweden, they will talk in Farsi until another Iranian comes on in the bus, and then they will switch to Swedish because there's this suspicion between different political communities. Yes. Among Iranians here and also in Iran. So in this particular field of Iran, I think it was perhaps even more easy for me as a complete outsider.
Okay. Returning to my second question about lived religion or lived Islam, you mentioned in your explanations, and you wrote this in your book, that you want to approach religious experiences from the perspective of those who live that religion. I mean, this is a relatively new approach in Islamic studies, and kind of new, I mean, and this investigation of lived Islam, or kind of in a more general way, lived religion, instead of studying books and written sources. Could you explain a little bit about this approach and this contribution to the whole field of Islamic studies?
I mean, obviously, a religion like Islam, you have, if you view what is it as a cultural phenomenon, and then it exists on many different levels. It's sort of a number of scriptures. It is a scholarly philosophical tradition, or many philosophical traditions. It is a legal tradition. And you can study, as you do in an Islamic, if you've studied from an Islamic perspective, you can choose whatever aspect of the religion you want to study. And then usually from an insider perspective, and this is true also of other religions, of course, when you say the word Islam, you mean the ideals of Islam, what it should be. But then there is, of course, this difference between any religion or ideology, between what it should be, what we hope that it is, and what it actually is. So if we take another example, we could study socialism as a political ideology. Then they have the ideals of socialism, that everyone should be equal, and it should be sort of a secular, equal society where everyone owns everything together, or whatever, and it's perfect and good. And then we have sort of lived socialism, and that is how this system is experienced and what happens to it in reality. So there's always this idea, a difference between the ideals and practice. So this is the first thing. So Islam and Christianity and Hinduism and all religions, they have their ideals and then their practice. And both are interesting to study. But if you are on the level of practice, then you can study, for instance, a society. I mean, if Iran, you could study how the Islamic Republic, how it works, how the different institutions interact, and the financial aspects of it, sort of the big sort of society aspects of actually, when you speak about Islam, the word saying that this is a study of lived Islam can be a bit confusing, because it's not the study of Islam, if you by Islam mean the ideal of Islam. It's a study of Muslims. So it's more clearer, I think, to say this is the study. We're not studying Islamic studies. We're studying Muslim societies and cultures. We're studying Muslim societies and cultures. One thing that exists in Muslim societies and cultures is, of course, theology and philosophy and law. But in Muslim societies and cultures, there's also other things, such as eating food and having friends and marrying someone and having financial problems and having to live double works and saying prayers and just the lived reality of humans. So in the study of lived religion, people focus on want to be sort of close to the near life experience of people. And what role does religion have? In this case, what role does Islam or Muslim traditions and thoughts and ideas and communities and rituals and all these Muslim things, what role do they play in people's normal lives? And this, I suppose, is what I want to study in this book. And then what we see is that, I mean, the words of the philosophy and the theology and the rituals, they will intertwine in people's lives with their normal lives. So what they eat, how they think, how they deal with their problems and sorrows. So from this and this, I suppose, is sort of an anthropological perspective on religion. And if you want, where you're interested in people and humans and their lives, more than the systems of thought. So you're interested in people and their lives. And if we're interested in religious people and their lives and thoughts and everyday realities, then we will see that religion, you cannot sort of take religion and detach it from the people. You have to see that it's always intertwined with the kind of life that they live. So if I take my own religious tradition as an example, okay, I told you I have this Christian family background. It means to me, for instance, that some Christian atmospheres, for instance, the smell, if you go into a church, which I did when I was a child, we were often in the church, and in the church, like in Sweden, we have old medieval churches. They're made from stone, like old stone buildings. They're a bit moist often. It's kind of cold. And there's a smell, which is the smell of candles. You know, they have lots of candles. And then when you blow out a candle, the smoke comes and there's a very specific smell. And when you come into a church, you smell this specific scent of candles and wet stone walls, sort of. This is the smell. And when I feel that smell, when I come now, even now as a grown-up person, and I visit churches sometimes, but not very often, but when I come there, I would be thrown back to my childhood. This is the smell of my childhood, you know. And when we think about our childhood, for many people, there is happiness and it was innocent and happy, but there's always a tinge of sadness also, because maybe there was something lost, maybe there were some sadnesses in your childhood, and you sort of get connected to that feeling and it becomes very personal. So my loyalty, for instance, then to this church, I like that in the same way as I like my parents or my grandmother's house or something like this. It's profoundly personal, not because I hold necessarily the teachings of the church or the philosophy of Christian thought or something, not because I hold those things to be true and I'm very loyal to the dogma, but because this is profoundly personal to me. I am loyal. It touches me just like coming to my grandmother's house touches. It touches my heart. It has like a direct connection to my heart. I even have a story about that I've written about, because when I was in these when I did my field work in the beginning, you know, I attended all these dua kumails and all these sort of prayer meetings where people were crying, and they would sit and they would cry to the story of Hussein, and there would be these beautiful mosques with the carpets and the stars above, and there was often the smell of rose water that has a very sort of specific smell, and the light was special, and the specific sound of these loudspeakers, and you know, the echo of the loudspeaker, and the specific intonation of these Arabic prayers and the Persian stories and the clothes people were wearing, everything together, it creates a very specific mood or atmosphere. And for my friends there in Iran, the people I interviewed, when they came to this meeting, I mean, the moment they came into this, I mean, maybe they took this wuzu first. When they feel this, the coldness of the water on their faces, they get into this mood, specific atmosphere. But and that's because they have been there since they were kids. They've been socialized into that from a sociological perspective. When I came there, it was beautiful and fantastic, but it didn't have this childhood connection for me, obviously. So I sat there on the meetings and I listened to these sad stories, and you know, all the things in the Karbala paradigm and all the things that happened there, and very sad stories. And I was moved, and I was mostly moved, I think, because my friends were moved and they cried and everything. But I didn't really cry. I couldn't really cry. It didn't really get to me in that way. Partly because I'm Scandinavian, and Scandinavian men don't cry that much, but we have been sort of taught not to do that. So it may be a cultural thing, but I couldn't really cry that much. But then after a couple of weeks or months, I learned that there was a church in, there are many churches in Isfahan, in Jolfa. So I visited one of those churches, and it was a church that had a tradition that was similar to the one that I come from. And I come to this, and the thing is, the story in the mosque is the story of Imam Hussein, this man from, Middle Eastern man from 1,000 years ago in the old times, who bleeds. He bleeds into the desert. I mean, this is the story. He's a bleeding man who sacrifices himself for God or for truth. And then I come to the church, and I want to visit it because I'm interested in also Christianity in Iran and all religions. So I come there, and I get to come in, and I come there on a Sunday where they're having a service. And they're very friendly and welcome. You can join us if you want. And it's a church. It's a stone church. It has stone walls. And the smell there is the smell of candles burning. So it's like a complete throwback to my childhood thing. And there were... in churches, people sit in this type of churches, you sit in benches like this, wooden benches, and there are wooden benches there, and you get one of these hymnal books that you have in churches in this tradition, and it's just exactly the same feeling as in my childhood church. And I sit there, and I sing in the songs, and it's the same songs even as my childhood. It's the same melodies, and oh my God, this is too much. And then, there's this in Christianity, this Holy Communion, when you go up to the podium of the church, and the priest will give you the bread and the wine, which symbolizes the blood and body of Christ. And I go up there, and he gives me this bread and wine, and he says, Badan Masihi, Khun Masihi ke baraye to richte shod. I think, yeah, Khun Masihi ke baraye to richte shod.
So they do this service in Persian.
Yes. So the blood of Christ that has been spilled for you. This is, and when he says those words, I can't hold back. So there's 3 months of unreleased crying in Shiite prayer meetings. Suddenly I just start crying because I needed my Middle Eastern old guy who is bleeding for God. I needed him. And I needed those smells and those sounds and that feeling, the particular type of feeling that was connected to my childhood, that I had learned as a, we have this. There's this, maybe this French author Marcel Proust, who has this. There's this famous story of someone who goes into a cafe and orders a specific type of cookie, and when he eats this cookie, he's immediately thrown back to his childhood because he got one of those cookies from his grandmother or something. So it's a moment like that, and this says something about how if you're interested in how religion works in people's lives, the psychology of religion, if you want, or the emotional aspects of religion, well, then you have to study these aspects. So this is lived religion. And of course, there is a theology about Christ and his blood on the cross, and there's a theology about Imam Hussein who dies in Karbala, and their sacrifice and what it means for Islam, and this we can study in the books. And there is a textual history of how these stories have been told, and that's very interesting and important. And then you can study it in the text and in the sort of textual history of Shiite Islam or Christianity or whatever religion. But if you want to understand what it means for real people, then you cannot only study the textual history. You also need this lived aspect of it. And I think if you want to, one famous definition of religion is that it creates moods and motivations. So moods, feelings that trigger people to do something. Maybe to stop drinking if you're Rasul Turk, or maybe to engage politically for one question or another question, or maybe to try to better your life in your family, or maybe to do something mean and violent. I mean, it can be different things, but it's moods that creates motivations. And if you want to understand how that works, then this personal lived aspect is needed, I think.
Yeah, thank you. I have other questions as well, but there is not so much time left. So this would be my last question. About actually a large part of the studies of Western researchers about Islam and Muslims is focused on the Arab world. It's probably due to the language barrier. They mostly know Arabic and do not know Persian, Urdu, and Turkish. But your research about Iranian actually, I think, adds to this, to diversity of these research. My question is, what is the importance and value of this diversity? I mean, from the Persian audience's point of view, I would like to know how does this research and other research in Shi'i society and Iranian society contribute to the field of ethnographic research, actually, mostly in Islamic studies?
Yes, I mean, if in Islamic studies or in the study of Muslim societies and cultures, obviously, if you study the textual history, the early Islamic history and so on, the Arabic sources are extremely important. I mean, and Arabic language is the most important language for the study of Islam, for obvious reasons. If you think of the textual story, the theology, and so on. But if you're interested in sort of lived Islam and Islam as a societal, as an ideology, as a way of life, something that is important for real people in the real world, or sort of in the tangible real world that we can study, then we have to know that Arabs are, I mean, obviously the Arab world is very diverse, and it's a huge 22 countries, so it's a huge and varied area, of course. But a majority of the world's Muslims are not Arabic. The biggest Muslim country is Indonesia, and I think it's perhaps the second biggest is Bangladesh, or in terms of population. We have a huge Muslim population in China. India has an enormous, in terms of numbers, Muslim population. Pakistan, and obviously Iran, Afghanistan, Central Asia, and these countries, which are, as you say, studied comparatively. And I think the language barrier, perhaps, but also the association of Islam with the Arabic language creates this sort of overemphasis on the Arab world. So it's very important, of course, that people from these countries and from these who have these languages as their native languages, but also people from all over the world help to study Islam in all its variants. And I think perhaps the least studied, I would say, is Indonesia, sort of Southeast Asian Islam, because people interested in Thai traditions, for instance, they will not focus on the Islamic minority in Thailand. They will write about the Buddhists. So there's this, that's a problem. But we have to just keep on working and keep on writing and keep on involving all kinds of perspectives and all kinds of types of studies, both textual and ethnographic and sociological and psychological and economical, to understand ourselves. This is what we do in the universities. We try to understand the reality from a variety of different perspectives, and we should do that also of Persian versions of Islam.
Yes, great. Thank you so much for your time, David, and I'm really it was really fascinating hearing about your experiences in Iran and other parts of the world, actually. If you want to have some final words in Persian for our audiences, we are ready to hear.
Okay. من 1996 در دانشگاه اصفهان درس خواندم. پس 30 سال قبل فارسی درس خواندم، بعد چند بار رفت و برگشتم به ایران. الان چند سال گذشت که من به ایران نرفتم و به خاطر این خیلی از لغت‌های ایرانی از یادم رفتن و این خیلی ناراحت کننده است، اما انشالله در آینده فارسی من دوباره خوب میشه.
Maybe we could do some practices together.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
It was a pleasure. Bye-bye.